Shalom. Shalom, thank you for being here once again. Truly, thank you very much. For today, we have the continuation of the Mishnah tractate we are studying, Blessings or Berakhot, in its Mishnah chapter 1, teaching Mishnah 5. But as is customary in this free course, I urge you, if you find it helpful, to share it. Share this link with your friends and people of interest, so that we can share this content with them, which will undoubtedly help you delve into the depths of biblical studies, understanding the context of the sacred scriptures. Because as we have been teaching, without context, there is no truth. It is the only way to understand ancient texts, to try to understand the circumstances experienced by the authors of the Mishnah in a 2nd century where the Roman Empire was mercilessly wreaking havoc against the oppressed peoples of the Mediterranean and the Near East. But as I was saying, as is customary, we are going to do a little review to sharpen our memory, that collective memory that is so important for scholars of the Mishnah or oral tradition. Now, as usual, we'll briefly review the previous class, Mishnah Teaching 4, from Chapter 1 of Berakhot Blessings, which teaches that the reading of the night Shema and the morning Shema are preceded by 2 blessings, and 2 more blessings are added at the end. If you haven't seen the previous class yet, I urge you to do so, or if you need to watch it again to reinforce and remember these concepts. But as usual, here's a Yiddish or a new development. In the previous Mishnah, the 4th, we see that there are no discussions or controversies, although in the Mishnah teaching before this one, 1.3, there was a discussion between the house of Shema and the house of Hillel. But why is there no discussion or controversy here? Indeed, there was always a bipolarity in opinions and interpretations between Shammai and Hillel, but why not here? Here we are talking about the public recitation of the night and morning Shema in the synagogue, in houses of worship, with a minimum of 10 adult males, which is called a minyan. The Mishnah teaches us that when it comes to praying, crying out to God in a group, in the collective, there is no division. Here everything is a unity of the community. When it comes to praying in public, there are no divisions, one group doing it one way and another group doing it another way. In the liturgy, there are no divisions. But here's a question. If since the 2nd century the sages of the Mishnah taught that there are no liturgical divisions between the house of Shammai and Hillel when praying, why have there been differences between Sephardim and Ashkenazim, for example? Since the Middle Ages, or even in Siddurim prayer books, if there are differences in the prayers? Well, here's the answer. All current Siddurim or prayer books contain the same fundamentals of the main prayers, the Shema, the Amidah, and their blessings added before and after. But the differences are not legal or halakhic. The current differences are based primarily on minchajim customs. Remember that we have taught you that 2nd century Judaism, where the context of the Mishnah is located, is a very different Judaism from 16th century Judaism or from today's Judaism. Today's Judaism is full of customs and traditions that have been added to the diverse communities that have migrated around the world for almost 2 millennia. At each stop, some of which lasted for centuries, people have added customs and traditions. Since the 16th century, at one of Judaism's turning points, tradition or custom became law, a norm, and entered halakha. But based on the oral tradition, the teachings of the Tannaitic sages, this was not the case. The prayers of the Tannaitic sages of the Mishnah were shorter, more direct, and more imbued with the foundations of the oral tradition that comes from the Second Temple, the school of the prophets, and the reconstructionists of Second Temple Judaism in the time of the biblical figures Azarya and Nehemiah. The text studies and prayers of the Tannaim sages of the Mishnah were shorter, more precise, I would even say more humane. But Judaism today is very different, because customs became law. They entered halakha. Now that you understand these things, you should know that when you look at a siddur or prayer book of our time, the prayers are pages and pages that seem endless, especially when recited 3 times a day. You should know that most of those prayers were minchajim customs that were added over time. But neither Moses nor Jesus prayed that way, not even close. Of course, don't be confused. The foundation was the same, but the customs weren't legislated, they weren't law, until the 16th century, when a new Judaism began. Laws of men? This is a question I leave for your reflection. The 16th century was a turning point. not only for Judaism, but for humanity, with the discovery of America, the reorganization of a new world order at that time, the invention of the printing press. All of this affected the world, including Judaism.
By the way, every time we talk about Judaism or Christianity, you should know something here. Strictly speaking from an academic point of view, although they are singular words, the reality is that they are plural. There is no one Judaism. There are several Judaisms, just like Christianity. There isn't one singular one. There are several Christianities. That is the academic reality.
Although by custom, speaking of customs, we have become accustomed to naming them in the singular, but that is not the case. There are several schools, several interpretations, several groups and doctrines, and all of them united form the religions that exist today, which together have also formed the Judeo-Christian civilization. Now, since we discussed the life of Rabbi Elazar in the last class, the great rabbi who studied with Shema but emigrated unwillingly or forced by circumstances to the school of Hillel, and who was excommunicated in his later years. By the way, Rabbi Elazar was the first sage cited by the Mishnah, as we already taught in the Tana. That is, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, who is the editor of the complete Mishnah, includes as his first textual citation a rabbi who, by then, was already known to have been excommunicated. In fact, Yehuda Hanassi and Rabbi Elazar aren't even from the same generation, and yet the Mishnah lists him as its first textual source, a Tannite sage. Why? Because even minority, complicated, and non-consensual opinions deserve to be preserved for future generations, to leave them a lesson that in every generation there will be controversy, and there will be someone with the spirit of Rabbi Elazar. But also remember that Rabbi Elazar, before being excommunicated, was one of the pillars of this entire oral tradition that was captured in this encyclopedia called the Mishnah. Because in life, every person has several stages, and at none of those stages are we the same person. Now, let's move on to a new sage. Rabban Gamliel, who in that first Mishnah about the night Shema is the second sage cited by the Mishnah. Who is this figure? He also taught in that Mishnah that the night Shema is until dawn, even saying that the wise Shachamim said it until midnight, but that they also agreed with him. So that you understand a new Yiddish in that Mishnah's teaching, Rabban Gamliel spoke above the sages of his time without being excommunicated, because he understood the difference between a rabbinic fence protecting the Torah and the limits imposed by the Torah itself. That is, he understood the soul of the Torah to give life to the scriptures. Now we move on. Let's go. How do you govern a people who no longer have a temple, no land, no army, no sovereignty, but still have memory, pride, and a God who will not budge even if the Roman Empire evicts him from his home? Well, if anyone had to answer that question with real, difficult, and sometimes uncomfortable decisions, it was Rabban Gamliel. And not from a throne, but from a classroom in Jabna, a city located in Israel between Jerusalem and what is now known as the Mediterranean city of Tel Aviv. Without gold, without incense, without choirs of Levites, but with a Sanhedrin under Roman supervision. A kind of leadership that required more than faith. It required strategy. And guts. As the Argentinians would say, balls, and boy did Rabban Gamliel, a disciple of Hillel's school, have them. Before continuing, we invite you to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with those who seek to understand the world from a different perspective. Thank you for being part of this community that doesn't settle for the superficial, the Codigo Abel community. With special thanks to the speaker, journalist Abel Flores. Rabban Gamliel ben Shimon ben Hillel, that was his name, and as you can see, he was part of a dynasty. He was neither the son nor the grandson of just anyone. He had blue blood, so to speak. Yes, a long name, but not for ostentation, but rather for lineage. We are talking about the grandson of Hillel the Elder, a legend of Jewish thought, the one who, as we have already said, may have spoken with the infant Jesus Yeshua when he visited the temple in Jerusalem. This fact is not necessarily historical, but it is probable in the history of Second Temple Judaism. And that tells you a lot. Gamliel was no improviser. He came to power at the worst possible time, just after Rome burned the Second Temple to the ground in 70 AD. Imagine assuming the presidency of the Sanhedrin when the entire religious structure that gave meaning to Judaism had just disappeared. Not a bad welcome letter. And what did Gamliel do? Weep? Withdraw? No. He reorganized everything. Literally. He redefined worship, standardized prayers, strengthened the oral Torah, consolidated calendars, adjusted festivals. He transformed chaos into order, and he did it while smiling at the empire pointing a sword at him. Because, make no mistake, the Jabna school operated under Roman permission, a kind of monitored autonomy, an uneasy balance between rabbinic dignity and forced diplomacy. And this is where the awkward part begins. Because Gamliel's leadership wasn't exactly a horizontal and participatory democracy. No, he believed in unity, but also in authority. His own, of course. The Mishnah and the Talmud tell us that he was firm, even authoritarian, that he didn't tolerate public dissent well, that he had strong clashes with other sages, like Rabbi Yehoshua ben Shenania. These clashes with his fellow rabbis were so strong that they ended up temporarily removing him from his position as president of the Sanhedrin. He wasn't excommunicated, but he was sanctioned. Wow, what we're learning about these days. What they did to Rabban Gamaliel was a kind of spiritual impeachment. But he came back. He always came back. Because, despite his harsh style, everyone knew that without Gamliel, the edifice was shaky. In an increasingly dispersed diaspora, he sought legal uniformity, a Shema recited at the same time, an Amida with the same words, a ritual law with the same standards of purity. Because if each community did its own thing, Judaism would be diluted. And he knew it. That's why he argued until dawn, literally. Gamaliel was the Kabbalist of his generation. Here's a new Yiddish. Generally, the president of the Sanhedrin was the most advanced in Kabbalah, or Hebrew mysticism. The Mishna records that Gamliel allowed the Shema to be recited until dawn, more flexible than his colleagues. But be careful, not because he was lax, but because he was realistic. Because he understood that the norm should help achieve compliance, not just set the ideal. And speaking of ideals, how do you negotiate with the empire? Because Gamliel didn't live in the abstract. Rome was there, with legions, with tributes, with vigilance. And he had to navigate between two fires, fidelity to the Torah and diplomacy with Caesar, who was nothing more than a genocidal maniac. Dangerous? Very much so. Hypocritical? Not necessarily. Cunning. Because without that balance, there would be no Jabna, no Sanhedrin, no liturgy, no Mishnah. Only ruins. But let's not think of Gamliel as a bureaucrat of the soul. His legacy is not just organizational. It's spiritual. He laid the foundations for the daily liturgy, the Shema, the Amida, those prayers that millions of people, Jewish or not, still recite every morning and every night today, were born, consolidated, and formalized under his leadership. And he didn't do it alone. He did it with a generation of sages whom he prepared, trained, and sometimes also confronted.
Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Tarfon, his own son Shimon ben Gamliel too, all those names who later illuminated the Mishnah were part of that seedbed. Because yes, although the Mishnah was formally compiled a century later, its architecture began in those years, in those discussions, in those classrooms, in that delicate fabric of memory, interpretation,
and oral transmission. And when Gamliel died, at the beginning of the 2nd century, he didn't leave a vacuum. He left a structure. His son succeeded him, and the Hillel dynasty continued to rule the Sanhedrin until the 5th century. For centuries. Not bad for a system without a temple, without an army, and without territory, but with texts, with wise men, with a people who transformed tragedy into method and exile into cultural resistance. Of course, none of this came without a price. There were tensions. There were conflicts. There were tough decisions. Gamliel wasn't a saint to many. He was a leader. And like any true leader, he had to choose between the ideal and the possible, between the pure and the political, between truth and unity. And he often chose unity, not because he didn't believe in the truth, but because he knew that without community, truth becomes useless. or worse, dangerous in the knowledge of a few. Listen to this. When knowledge isn't shared, it's harmful. Because as that teacher from Galilee said, who lights a lamp and leaves it under a bed? So the next time you see a community reciting the same prayers on different continents in different languages, but with the same melody, think of Rabbi Gamliel, of that man who, from the ruins of Jerusalem, decided that the temple could not be rebuilt, but the nation could. From the word, because man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God, as Moses taught. It is said that Gamaliel performed miracles, that he even raised the dead. And also, a curious fact or piece of information that you may not know, Gamaliel, the one we're talking about, is the only sage of the Mishnah of the Tanaim who is cited or named in the New Testament, wrongly called the New Testament, by the way, because the Apostle Paul claims to have studied at the feet of Rabbi Gamaliel, which gives us some context to understand Saul of Tarsus, but this is not the point being made. Returning to the topic, Gamaliel's life wasn't just about personal power, but about divine supervision of the person, the individual, or hashgacha pradet. His obsession was to avoid the fragmentation of the collective of the group. Remember a religious ethical group that was being mercilessly exterminated by the Romans? Now, let's begin today's lesson. In the Mishnah, Tractate Blessings Berakhot 1.5, the following is taught: the exodus from Egypt is to be remembered at night. Rabbi Elazar ben Azarya said, "Behold, I am like a man of 70 years old, and I have not succeeded in having it stated that the exodus from Egypt is to be remembered at night, until Ben Zoma interpreted it, so that you may remember the day you came out of the land of Egypt all the days of your life." Deuteronomy 16 verse 3. The word all comes to include the nights. The sages of the Shachemim say, all the days of your life also include the days of the Messiah. In short, the issue here is the obligation to remember the exodus from Egypt not only by day, but also by night, when reciting the Shema. What is the dispute? Ben Zoma interpreted the word all, which, according to him, teaches that the mitzvah commandment also applies at night. The sages say that it also applies to the Messianic era, that is, when the Messiah, son of David, is revealed to establish the kingdom of God in heaven on earth. Now, let's try to decode what is taught in this Mishnah. Sometimes, the most decisive battles are not fought with swords, but with words repeated, twice a day. And yes, it seems like a minor, almost bureaucratic detail. Should we mention the exodus from Egypt at night or not? But in the 2nd century, for the sages of the Mishnah, that was a declaration of war, even if Rome didn't even notice. We speak of spiritual warfare because, as we have already studied the struggle, reality, the origin of things, is in the heavens. The earth is merely the receptor of spiritual energies. In other words, it's crystal clear. The problem of the 2nd century generation of sages was that they were without authority in their own land. They were slaves, and that problem was spiritual, not physical. The same thing happens to us today. Our problems have their origin in the spiritual world, which we have already explained are the intermediate worlds of Bria and Yetzirah. The Torah says, "You shall remember all the days of your life since you came out of Egypt." Beautiful, inspiring, but what does all mean? For the wise Chacham Ben Zoma, that all is not limited to dawn. It includes the night. It includes the dark moments, the hours when oppression never sleeps. Because what good is it to remember freedom only when it's light? Remember that allegorically, night in the Bible is a reference to exile, to the diaspora, when you have neither freedom nor power, when you are being oppressed by the government in power. That is your night. And the Shema is that powerful declaration that connects you with the only one who can fix cosmic problems, problems that are even older than the very creation of man. That one and indivisible king is the one to whom you cry out in the Shema. And here we must pause to imagine the context. Years after the Second Temple was reduced to ashes, Rome was not only still there, but had crushed the Bar Kokhba revolt with the delicacy of a sword. The Jewish people were not chained as in Egypt, but political freedom was a distant memory. Suffocating taxes, religious prohibitions, soldiers on guard, and a rabbinic leadership in Jabna and Galilee Trine, with bare hands and much poverty, to sustain an identity that threatened to crumble. So yes, saying we left Egypt in the liturgy wasn't nostalgia, it was resistance. A daily, or rather nightly, reminder that true sovereignty lies not with Caesar, but with the Creator. And that even under Roman rule, the soul has no human owner. As the saying goes, you may destroy my body, but never my soul. Because that belongs to the Creator, the Kabbalists would say. But make no mistake, the Egypt we speak of is not just geographical. Mitzrayim, the wise men of the Shachamim say, this Hebrew word comes from narrowness, from limitation in its literal meaning. Egypt Mitzrayim is everything that squeezes, that encloses, that reduces you. They are not just iron chains. They are those of greed, ego, materialism, the oppressive empire that oppresses your Judeo-Christian culture, your ideals, your values. And that slavery can be worse than that of any pharaoh, because it convinces you that you are free while it consumes you. A false freedom is worse than the awareness that you are a slave. Never forget this, especially in the current times of the 21st century, where we are dominated by highly advanced social engineering techniques. But here is the cure. Have faith, recite the Shema with Baidashan security, with conviction and clarity. Call on the only one who can save you, who is not a politician, nor a family member, but the Creator of the universe.
That's why the Shema, recited morning and night, functions as an antidote. It's not an amulet, it's a declaration. I do not serve gold, nor power, nor fashion. I serve the only one who sets me free. And saying it at night, when the darkness is both literal and symbolic, is the most subversive act possible. It's like lighting a torch in the middle of an
enemy fortress and shouting, here we are. We will not surrender. So the next time you hear someone reciting the Shema at the end of the day, don't see it as just another prayer. It's an echo of Egypt, a whisper of freedom in times of oppression, a resistance that not even Rome could quell. Because even though powers change, exile prolongs, and darkness falls, freedom is spoken. And it is spoken twice a day. Now let's delve into some teachings the Talmud reveals about this Mishnah. What part of all the days of your life is not understood? Why do the sages ask this? Well, we've already said it, because he who doesn't question doesn't evolve. He who doesn't ask doesn't understand. The phrase is there in Deuteronomy 16 verse 3, short and without anesthesia, so that you may remember the day you came out of Egypt, all the days of your life. But because there's always a but, words are stubborn and time is capricious. Does the days of your life mean only when it's sunny? And who does all include? The night or the entire future? If you think this is a technical term for jurists of the soul, wait. From this reading are born daily liturgy, inner discipline, and a theology that doesn't give up even when the empire tightens. And yes, here the Bible, Talmud, rival schools, concrete practice, and a profound meaning that asks no one's permission come together. Let's start from the beginning. Is there any other way to begin? The biblical foundation is the runway. Deuteronomy 16 verse 3 says, so that you may remember the day you came out of Egypt, all the days of your life. Two expressions make a good sound, the days of your life and all. They seem like amplifying synonyms, but they're not. They open up different paths. The days of your life sounds like the normal cycle, the luminous day by day. All is the wedge that pushes further. How further? Here comes the dispute. Ben Zoma takes the text by the flap and asks, if the verse already says the days, why does it add all? A sharp answer. To add what wasn't there, the night. If the days of your life refers to the daytime period, all also includes the dark hours. Very nice, yes, but it's not an ornament. It's the basis for deciding that the remembrance of the Exodus is not a morning salute to the flag, but also a nocturnal obligation. A direct liturgical consequence? In the evening Shema, in the Arvit prayer or night prayer, the explicit mention of the Exodus from Egypt is inserted through the third paragraph, Vayomer, Numbers 15:37, 41. This is written in the Siddur or prayer book that you can purchase at any Jewish store. There are even digital ones online. And no, it's not a detail, just for Pesach or Passover. The Talmud makes it clear. This applies every day of the year. Why? Because the memory that sustains you cannot depend on the festive calendar. Either you breathe it daily, or it ceases to be oxygen. Now, not everyone applauds the same film. The sages, the rabbinical majority of that time, look at the same verse and see another dimension. They accept that all expands, yes, but not toward night. It expands toward history. The days of your life designates life in this world, the present era, the one where we deal with kings of flesh and blood and our own contradictions. All, on the other hand, stretches toward the era of the Messiah. Does Jeremiah 23 verses 7 to 8 sound familiar? The prophet announces a future redemption so immense that it would eclipse that of Egypt with a worldwide redemption. But the Talmud does not let publicity overwhelm history. Egypt will not be left unmentioned. Both redemptions will be mentioned together, in a chorus that never erases its first voice. Let's move on to the halakhic implications, as no one came here just to contemplate pretty ideas. From the cross readings, a firm agreement emerges. The exodus from Egypt must be mentioned twice a day. First, in the morning on Shesharet. Second, at night on Arvit. How is this fulfilled? With the Vamer, Numbers 15:37, 41, the third paragraph of the Shema, which bluntly names the redemption from Egypt. Therefore, in the Messianic era, the Exodus will also be remembered. Not out of nostalgia, but out of fidelity to the origin that explains Hior even when the world finally lives up to its promise. And how is this lived out in today's practice? The Shulchan Aruch, Chapter Arachim 67.1, codifies it without hesitation. You are obligated to remember the Exodus from Egypt day and night. Period. In real life, this is fulfilled with the Shema in Shesharet, the morning prayer, and Arvit, the night prayer. And yes, even those who don't formally recite the Shema must remember every day. And to close the circle, Ben Zoma teaches us that it is not enough to remember in the light of the sun. We must confess freedom even in the darkness. The sages teach us that the present is not enough. We must remember even when the future is brighter than the past. And here is a revealed theme. Just as the liberation from Egypt was achieved through a prophet, Moses, so the future redemption will be achieved through a king from the house of David, where his kingdom will have no end. That king is the Mashiach, the Messiah. I'm not saying this. The Shachamim of the studied Mishna say so, because it is no coincidence that they link the freedom from Egyptian slavery with the worldwide freedom that the Messiah will bring. If you made it this far, thank you. Truly, thank you for staying, for listening, for thinking. If this content resonated with you, we invite you to subscribe to the channel, leave us a like, share it, and become part of this critical community that grows every day. This is with gratitude, as always, from Abel Flores. And so we conclude with this 5th Mishnah, chapter 1 of the Tractate of Blessings, Berakhot. There are 9 chapters in total. See you in the next video.